So, hello everybody. My name is Oliver Gieden. I'm chairing that rather brief session we have here that will then be followed by the plenary right afterwards with 8 people showing up. That starts at 3. So we have 3 presentations by David Reiner, by Joseph Spitzer, and by Glenn Peters. And we will try to restrict the presentations to 50 minutes so that we have some time for questions and answers. And we will have to close 2 or 3 minutes before 3 p.m. So we will start with David Reiner from the University of Cambridge. It's your floor.
Great, thank you, Oliver. So we've heard moral hazard mentioned a few times over the last couple of days. So I thought I would try something radical, which is actually providing empirical evidence into this debate that we have on negative emissions. And in particular, what we've done is commissioned a survey across the UK. So it's one small part of the world's view on this, but at least it is some, again, empirical evidence, some fodder for thinking about nets, I think in general, and thinking particularly about how we might begin to conceptualize concerns over moral hazard. So the first thing to say is, going into this, anytime as a social scientist you're trying to explore a concept that virtually nobody knows about or has heard about, you already sort of come up against a number of barriers. I've been doing CCS surveys, public surveys for my sins, dating back to about 2002 or 2003, and the level of, as we'll see, the level of understanding and awareness of CCS, which is a much more established technology, is still quite minimal. So asking questions then about bioenergy plus CCS is likely to elicit lots of blank stares, or the equivalent at the end of a survey. The other important point is one that Dutch colleagues like Donker Damen and Marjolein de West-Waldhober have made, which is when you are trying to ask questions about technologies that people haven't heard about, is that they often will give you pseudo-opinions. And so we have to take great care as to how much we can really use kind of the results, and often try and frame or ask questions in a way that will be more accessible, more understandable to the respondents, to the public that are being asked these questions. And so that's one of the tricks that we've had to think carefully about in terms of developing a set of what I might call answerable questions. And so what that might mean is needing to think about the role that information plays, and need to think about the role that alternative framings might play. So we commissioned this survey at the beginning of the year. We launched it. It was conducted by the market research firm YouGov in the middle of March 2018. It was administered to 2,000 or so randomly selected adults above 18 from across Great Britain, so not Northern Ireland, but the Great Britain, and drawn from YouGov's larger panel of close to 200,000 individuals in the UK. And some of the objectives, some of the things we tried to get out of the survey, and I'll only be able to touch on a few of the results, a few of these 26 questions, is to understand what sort of levels of awareness and support there are for negative emissions technologies, try and understand better the trade-offs between sustainability and cost, think a little bit more about the public perceptions of moral hazard, and I think that's moral hazard writ large, and also try and understand the role that information and framing plays. And this, I should mention, was supported by an existing EPSRC Research Council, UK Research Council's grant. First question is, have you heard or read about any of the following long list of technologies in the past year? And there are a number of things which people have heard about or know about. Smart meters, which are in the process of being rolled out in the UK, cars, solar energy, wind energy, fracking, which had been even a hotter topic a couple of years ago, nuclear energy, and then we keep going down the long list. You finally come to carbon capture and storage. So, 12 years after 15 years after the first efforts at studying this, we find all of 12% of the British public have paid any attention to this in the last year. Then you keep dropping further. Geoengineering, which some of us have been talking about here, 5%. Negative emissions technology, 5%. BECCS, 5%. Direct air capture, 3%. Land reification. Anybody knows what land reification is? Nothing, it's imaginary. So, but you find that something like 2% of our sample is willing to say they've heard of an imaginary technology. So when 3% say they've heard of direct air capture, that might be telling you that virtually nobody has really heard or read about it. They just don't like admitting it even to a survey. The other things that are striking, and when we talk about, we've heard again a few times about public engagement, is that there is not a single unwashed public, unwashed masses. There are various degrees, various sorts of levels of engagement that the public has with, say, the topic of energy more generally, and you have, and this is all self-designated, but something like 7% of our sample said that they are very knowledgeable about energy. 21% said they were, four on a scale of 1 to 5, whereas, another more than a quarter said they're either, 1 or 2 on that same scale. And what do you see? You see that those who are self-assessed as not knowledgeable about energy know virtually nothing about any of these technologies, whereas those who assess themselves as being the most knowledgeable, actually, not quite the majority, but at least a large number can identify, have been heard about CCS. Some have heard about BECCS, particularly those who are very, very knowledgeable. And even amongst those who are very knowledgeable, only 11% will say that they know anything or have heard anything, read anything about negative emissions technologies. There's just a different way of saying this. Something like 50% of the sample said they've never heard at all of this, and then you've got differing degrees of how polite people want to be in saying that they really haven't heard about a technology. I think more interesting, and these are fairly robust in terms of supported by past studies, both studies we've conducted at Cambridge, other studies that have been conducted by others and in other countries. There's very strong support if you had a portfolio for the things that we all know and love: solar, wind, energy-efficient cars, energy-efficient appliances. And that gets, really nice, kind of 3/4 of the sample expressing active support for it. Then there's a set of technologies that are still supported, but not quite so actively, and that includes nuclear energy, bioenergy, fuel switching. You do notice, though, that the negatives on nuclear, particular, regardless of what we heard about in our first keynote, have not gone away, even in the UK, which is kind of probably the country in Europe that's most supportive of nuclear energy. Then there's a number of other technologies where there's a split, and there we find BECCS, coal CCS, gas CCS, where there's probably a slightly more people support it than don't support it, but you probably have more people who say they don't know, or they're sort of not really taking a position on the subject. It is worth pausing here to remember that, just a slide ago I was saying most people in the UK haven't heard of BECCS. But that doesn't mean that, you still don't get 40% of the public then weighing in on whether they support or oppose this technology. So, that's, again, an important thing to keep in mind, right? But then what's also interesting, I think, and again, this is fairly consistent. We provide just very, very brief description of each of the technologies, is that those that might be considered closer to geoengineering, particularly closer to the SRM, solar radiation management end of it, are even less well supported. And there's actually quite a degree of sort of hostility, opposition, not just to injecting aerosols into the stratosphere or enhanced weathering, but even something like painting your roofs white, which is, I think, interesting in itself. Okay, so moral hazard, that was in the title. I'll try and spend the next couple of minutes talking about that. If you look at, and this is partly how the public perceives it or how they understand it, so I'm glad Glenn is here for me to harass him gratuitously. So if you read science, you think you're reading a fairly provocative but fairly careful article about what we in this room would think of as negative emissions technologies like BECCS. But when you see that actually translated into how, for example, just Anderson, Kevin Anderson and Glenn Peters' article, you find all sorts of other things start creeping into it. So, in this story, we have, a large coal-fired plant that's somehow associated with the moral hazard that's being discussed. To be generous, even in the Cicero press release, reliance on negative emissions lock in humankind's carbon addiction. So there's a nice photo of Glenn and Kevin, and the large photo underneath it is the Prime Minister Stoltenberg in front of Technology Center Mongstad. So again, you might, unless you're completely immersed in this, slightly get confused as to whether we're talking about BECCS and negative emissions or whether we're talking about CCS and other technologies that the public might not understand. The other, again, striking thing here is, moral hazard has been described in a number of different ways. And depending upon where you stand, where you sit, that might have a different perspective. So, for example, we've known about moral hazard and used it in common discourse in talking about central banks, going back to Bagehot in the mid-19th century. We've spent a fair bit of time thinking about the questions of insurance and even moral hazard. So there's a piece by Neil Adger, for example, looking at moral hazard in the context of climate adaptation and how that might undermine efforts at mitigation. But there isn't necessarily a consensus view, even in the literature, as to how to describe moral hazard. Or at least there isn't a consensus amongst, once you move beyond the sort of traditional economics field. And I think Paul Krugman probably sums up fairly nicely the way this is perceived by most economists, which is essentially as some sort of principal-agent problem. There is no morality particularly associated with this. It is really this question of other people assuming risks and somebody else bearing those risks if things go badly. On the other hand, you've got financial industry, which talks about good faith and bad faith contracts, providing misleading information about assets and liabilities, again, taking unusual risks, which is starting to have more of an implication of morality. And then back to science, you can read in that article just a couple of months ago about the carbon harvest, what I think is a deeply misleading description of moral hazard, saying, they're talking about David Keith, so it's not quoting David, but it's saying there's a perilous mismatch between models and reality that presents a moral hazard by committing future generations to technological solutions that may not work in the end. So isn't that way of understanding, if somebody reading that would think the problem isn't that BECCS will work, the problem is that they won't work at all. So again, it gets more and more confused. I couldn't get into a discussion with the public about this, so I tried to ask some basic questions that they would be more familiar with, which is, do you believe that people behave more recklessly if they have insurance? So we asked questions, and if you ask them about themselves and individuals, most people would say that that insurance doesn't make you more reckless. But when you ask about, effectively, the insurance that we provided to banks, and do banks behave more recklessly because they're not going to fail? Well, all of a sudden, there's a much stronger view that banks behave recklessly. The other striking thing is whether you actually own insurance actually has a big impact on your belief that insurance increases recklessness. So if you don't have travel insurance, you're much more likely to believe that people will behave recklessly than those who actually own the insurance. Because, oh, it's not me, I wouldn't be behaving recklessly, maybe others might be. And then, so finally, in the last couple of minutes left to me, I tried to give you the answers to this question that we had, which is very first effort at asking the question. There's different ways of trying to accomplish these negative emissions. One of them is to use bioenergy in power plants and then capture the CO2, a process we call BECCS. You try and be nice to people, say, well, few people have heard about it, don't worry about it, just tell us something. And you force people to answer the question. For half the sample, we just give that little blurb. For the other half of the sample, we also give this infographic that the Energy Technologies Institute developed, which just gives you a little bit more information and try and see if people behave or react differently to it. And this is kind of what I was having fun with the other day. You can start to go through the answers and what sort of responses do you get. Don't know kind of works together, sounds good, not a good idea. The word underground comes up a fair bit. When you give people more information, I'd need to do this in a bit more rigorous way. There's a bit less focus on the underground, less focus on storage, but maybe slightly more positive view overall, but a lot of questions, a lot of concerns that people ask in the process. And then I just try and very quickly show that there are, I think, some quite interesting takeaways, some interesting, and this is in at least the preliminary paper, I think some fairly thoughtful responses that people have. I mean, they're the climate skeptics, the people who think of it's all just a huge money-making con. There are actually probably the largest number, as I said, concerns over CO2 storage itself, and so lots of questions, lots of concerns about that. There are concerns about feedstock and what the source and sustainability of the feedstock would be. There's kind of a number of general concerns. There's also concerns, and this is kind of the closest to the kind of potential for a moral hazard, the sense that I like technology X, whether that's nuclear or wind or so on, and I'm worried that this is going to be undermining my preferred technology. There are actually some, I think, quite sort of thoughtful, interesting, almost detailed, kind of technical responses and questions that people have. There are a number of people who've come up with a more balanced, positive view, and then finally some very positive things that people have to say at the end. And I'm about to be taken off the stage by Oliver, so thank you very much.